The year is 1942. The location, Stalingrad. The name alone evokes powerful emotions within popular culture, and even more so in the memories of those who lived and died in the city during the battle itself. In terms of human casualties, the battle was the most costly in all of human history. Stalingrad was the culmination of a new era of mechanised warfare, and the antithesis to the bright future which modernity had seemed to usher in at the start of the century. A titanic battle of polar ideologies, Stalingrad, now the modern-day city of Volgograd, was the stage for the definitive battle between two new opposing totalitarian systems which had developed during the 20th century. Right-wing fascism on the one hand, and left-wing communism on the other. Both violent, brutal interpretations of modernity. Just 3 years earlier, however, at the start of the war, with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were allies. In September 1939, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia both invaded Poland simultaneously from the east and from the west, thus starting the Second World War. For the first 2 years of the war, an uneasy alliance existed between the Germans and the Russians, who were both content for the time being to divide Europe between themselves. Even before the war, Germany had annexed Austria in 1938 and taken the Sudetenland border region from Czechoslovakia unopposed. After Poland, Germany fought a whirlwind campaign known as the Blitzkrieg, which combined cutting-edge ground, armoured and air superiority to take the entirety of France, Belgium, the Netherlands and Norway by 1941. They also invaded North Africa, nearly taking Egypt from the British, and moved down into the Balkans to subdue Yugoslavia. Russia, on the other hand, used Germany's aggression as a shield for their own aggression against the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, and also Finland, which had all been part of Russia prior to the 1917 revolution where they broke away. The Baltic states were all brutally subdued. However, Finland, with an army composed mostly of farmers and people just protecting their own land, managed to eventually win against the numerically superior foe. By 1941, Hitler had had enough of his alliance with the Russians. As far as he was concerned, despite the huge tactical advantages to the alliance, his war, as he saw it, had always been to wrestle control of the East from the supposedly inferior Slavic nations who lived there, and to create living space or Lebensraum for the superior Germanic peoples. The Nazi idea of racial superiority was based upon the laughably incorrect pseudoscience known as social Darwinism, which was never taken seriously by actual scientists and only briefly got into the mainstream because of the terrible economic hardships of the 1930s, which had pushed the Nazis into power. Hitler, ever blinded by his own megalomania, and never one to listen to rational advice, soon gave the order to begin preparations for the invasion of Russia. When launched in the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa was the largest military campaign ever attempted. Over 4 million Axis men, 3,350 tanks, 2,770 aircraft, and 7,200 artillery pieces. The armies were multinational, comprised of Germans, Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, and even some Spanish. They took the Russians completely by surprise. Upon the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Russia had still essentially been a medieval feudal nation. For the peasants, although freed from economic slavery in 1861, little had changed. In fact, for many, emancipation had been worse than serfdom itself. Russia was an incredibly backwards nation compared to the other European superpowers of Britain, France and Germany, which had all industrialised during the 19th century and developed an educated middle class of sorts who could mediate between the super rich and the super poor. No such industrialisation took place in Russia, which was still a very unequal country, ruled by an aristocratic elite who held all of the power and all of the money. The turmoil of the First World War, coupled with centuries of abuse from the upper echelons of society, led the Russian people to rise up in popular revolt and overthrew the monarchy in the February Revolution in 1917. The world held its breath as a forward-looking democratic republic was installed in the place of the autocratic rule of the Tsars. Well, the story doesn't end there. It was just a few months before Bolshevik communist revolutionaries, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized control of the nation in the October Uprising. The Bolshevik Reds fought a civil war against the monarchists, moderates and conservative whites, who were supported by most of the nations of Europe, who were fearful of communism at the time. The Reds eventually won, however, and upon seizing control of the entire country, continued to collectivise everything in the nation and install communist rule, with every intention of creating a better future for Russians and the rest of humanity everywhere. Upon Lenin's death, however, in 1924, it became increasingly evident that this wasn't going to be the case, The party secretary, a young Georgian named Joseph Stalin, had begun quietly amassing power. This was a man who Lenin had actually warned his comrades to be wary of, and Stalin played off his political opponents against each other one by one over the next few years, often before they even realised what was happening, having them shot as traitors in the elaborate show trials of the 1930s. Eventually, he was the only major contender left for power, and one of the only old Bolsheviks left alive. Now having total power and control over the country, Stalin, the Red Tsar, continued to cultivate his cult of personality, becoming a godlike figurehead in a godless nation. He set about industrialising the nation in his famous 5-year plan, which amounted to a worse life than many had experienced under the Tsars before the revolution. His fanatical followers waged war against an imaginary class of rich peasants known as the kulaks, who in reality were just well-to-do people in villages and towns who had made something of themselves and were resented by their neighbours because of it. The 5-year plan also involved exporting nearly all of Ukraine's abundant supply of grain in return for industrial material, without actually letting the Ukrainians eat any of it. The Holodomor of the 1930s, which literally translates to death by hunger, was one of the most horrendous genocides of the 20th century, and one that received little attention at the time. As a direct result of Stalin's policies, millions starved to death en masse in their own homes, whilst the world looked on unaware. Show towns were made up for when journalists came to visit, in scenes reminiscent of North Korea today. By 1939, after a decade of atrocities, purges, persecution and genocide, Russia had industrialised. Upon the start of the Second World War, the Non-Aggression Pact with Germany allowed Russia to take back much of the land lost at the tail end of World War I, and began exporting its persecution and atrocities to the newly swallowed up nations. In 1918, in the Forest of Versailles in France, a peace treaty was signed, ending the war that was known as the War to End All Wars. The treaty agreed that Germany would take all of the blame and front the vast majority of the bill for the war. Many Germans, quite justifiably, would see this as a great betrayal by the politicians in power. One of them, a delusional young Austrian army officer named Adolf Hitler, took the mentality even further by associating the defeat not just with politicians, but with his least favourite minority, the Jews. Hitler soon joined a right-wing paramilitary organisation where his drive and his fiery speeches quickly put him to the top of the party leadership. The 1920s Weimar Republic was a relatively stable period in Germany compared to what was to come, and the Nazis, the same as the Communists, didn't get a huge amount of support besides some attempted coups which were easily suppressed. The 1929 Wall Street crash, however, changed everything. Financial help from the United States promptly ended, and the currency inflated so much in Germany that one needed a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. The government was in shambles. By 1933, the Nazis had become a real force to be reckoned with. Paramilitary groups of thugs walked the streets beating up Jews and communists, and eventually Hitler and the Nazi Party, seen as a better alternative to communism, got a third of the vote and were put into power, under the premise that they would make Germany great again. There was more to Hitler's hatred for the weak bureaucrats who lost World War I. Hitler saw all of the corruption in the world as being linked to a Jewish world conspiracy, such as the one supposedly exposed in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a forged document seen as completely genuine by many at the time. This warped worldview wasn't helped by a fairly widespread general anti-Semitic feeling in Europe, which tended to rear its ugly head at any time when anything went wrong. Unfortunately for anyone who wasn't a German, Hitler did get Germany's economy back on track. He also heavily discriminated against Jews, communists, homosexuals, and anyone else who he saw as undesirable. And by 1938, the Nazi rhetoric was so full on that they looked to absorb other supposedly Germanic nations into a greater Germany. For Hitler, the war was always to be one of German versus Slav and Jew. Underneath his rhetoric of making Germany great again, it was to be a war of annihilation to make land for a greater Germany. Upon invading Russia in 1941, this hunger plan began almost immediately. The 1 million Soviet soldiers surrounded at Kiev when Germany blitzkrieged into the Ukraine were placed in large open-air camps and left to starve to death en masse. Immediately behind the Standard Army Wehrmacht troops came the Einsatzgruppen, death squads who shot to death any Jewish civilians they found. By the time Germany got to Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, the war was an apocalyptic one of annihilation. For the Germans, it was a great crusade. For the Russians, a war of survival. By spring 1942, Despite failing to capture Moscow and Leningrad in the Blitzkrieg as Hitler had intended, his position was still strong. On a map, the Germans had taken vast swathes of Russia and decimated large amounts of the Red Army. 3 million men had been captured and some 20,000 tanks destroyed. These huge losses and the great sacrifices that the Soviets had made had allowed them enough time to divert much of the Russian industrial infrastructure to the east of the country, and supplies poured in over the Baltic and up through the Caucasus through Persia and the Allies, who now saw the Russians as the best way to defeat the Nazis and win the war. Hitler realised the importance of the Caucasus oil fields in crippling the Soviet economy and blocking supplies from the Allies, and he personally rewrote the German battle plans to take on a southerly direction and move the emphasis of the attack away from Moscow. By the summer of 1942, Army Group South was advancing headlong through the Red Army towards the oil fields of the Caucasus. Despite putting up fierce resistance, the Russians could do little to withstand the highly trained German war machine which steamrolled towards them. Propaganda and actual realities filtered back to both sides, who rarely took prisoners as a result. On July 28th, Stalin issued his famous "not one step backwards" order, whereby he explicitly forbade the Red Army to retreat. Trapped between the advancing Germans and the rearguard Red Army squads who would shoot to death any retreating soldiers, the Russians had no choice but to fight, and often they were killed virtually to a man in terrible last stands. To the Germans, the city of Stalingrad was little more than a name on the map, but to the Russians it became a symbol of resistance. They were loath to lose the city that bore the name of their leader, and so it was at Stalingrad on the Volga that they would make their stand. For both Stalin and Hitler, Stalingrad quickly became a matter of prestige far beyond its strategic significance. The Soviet High Command moved units from the Red Army Strategic Reserve in the Moscow area to the lower Volga, and transferred aircraft from the entire country to the Stalingrad region. Meanwhile, the German 6th and 4th Armies went to the Volga and the Don rivers, circling Stalingrad in a pincer movement. In early August, during the Kotlebane operations, 4 Soviet armies valiantly threw themselves against the German northern flank in an attempt to slow their advance towards the city. 200,000 soldiers lost their lives in this advance alone, while simultaneously the Red Army defended the grounds towards the city tooth and nail. The Soviets managed to get much of the grain and industrial infrastructure out of the city, but not most of its inhabitants, who had no choice but to bunker down with the Red Army and wait for the inevitable German advance, now with little food to eat and supplies to keep them warm. In 1942, the Luftwaffe was by far the largest and most powerful air force in the world, and it easily swept the Soviet Air Force aside. Enjoying total air superiority, the Germans thundered over the city, obliterating it in a maelstrom of firepower. As Stalin had refused to evacuate the civilian population, which prior to the battle had stood at around 400,000 people, a huge amount died in the bombing runs, which left the city little more than a charred landscape of ruins and rubble. But still, the Red Army stood its ground. With little choice but to fight, well over 10,000 Red Army soldiers were shot down by their own men whilst retreating during this period. But the vast majority do seem genuinely to have been spurred on by hatred of the Germans and by love of their own country. Eventually, utterly decimated by the Germans, the remaining Russians had no choice but to fall back to the outskirts of the city, where they set up forward command posts as close to the front as possible, whilst any and all available soldiers were rushed in from all corners of the country to bolster the city defenders. Many of these were raw conscripts, with no training or prior knowledge of warfare. On the 12th of September, the first battles began within the city limits. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, building to building. The Russians had quickly realised that the closer they were to the front line, the better protected they were from the Luftwaffe bombing runs which harried the defenders at will. Forward positions were set up just metres away from the advancing Germans, who paid dearly for every advance they made into the city. Street by street, the Germans inched their way through the charred ruins, with huge casualties being inflicted on both sides. The Russians used the city sewers to navigate around and to launch surprise attacks on the German infantry advancing through the city. By the end of September, however, and during mid-October, the Germans took nearly the entirety of the city, besides the northern factory district, where the defenders desperately clung on, awaiting reinforcements from the east. Intense sniper battles took place within the charred ruins as the Soviets churned out unpainted tanks from the factory district straight into the battlefield. Finally, after 3 months of intense harrying fighting, often hand-to-hand with shovels and blunt instruments, the Germans made it to the banks of the Volga. The Russians, with the exception of scattered pockets of resistance, were largely pushed to the far side of the river. Whilst the Germans held much of the city, the Soviets still controlled the ferries to their supplies on the east bank, and they continued to pour more and more reinforcements across the narrowly held strip of land. Many of these raw recruits, as opposed to the Germans, who mostly were veterans at this point. By this stage, the Russians had lost millions of soldiers, not to mention civilians. German losses also mounted up, as did their will to fight. But there had been method to the Russian madness. As the maelstrom of violence erupted around Stalingrad, the Red Army had been assembling a huge force, with the end goal of encircling Stalingrad entirely. The 22nd of January, the commander of the German Sixth Army, General Paulus, a seasoned battlefield commander, asked Hitler if he could pull out of the city and save the rest of his men. Hitler's response was to inform him of his immediate promotion to the rank of Field Marshal, a great honour, but a clear instruction from Hitler, as no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. As winter set in, the Sixth Army, for better or for worse, prepared to make its stand at Stalingrad. General Manstein, another legendary Wehrmacht commander, even came down from Leningrad to try and break through to free the trapped German soldiers. But they couldn't break through the Soviet forces, who had successfully bogged down the Germans enough at Stalingrad to regroup and amass for a counterattack. Unlike Hitler, Stalin left his generals to make their own military decisions. This was one of his strongest attributes as a leader, and Operation Uranus was what his commanders came up with. A massive Soviet counteroffensive, over 1 million Red Army troops had amassed around Stalingrad, and by February completed the encirclement of the city, along with the Sixth Army trapped within. For a while, the Germans were able to resupply their men from the air, but before long the situation became increasingly hopeless. On the 2nd of February 1943, General Paulus surrendered, along with the 91,000 Axis survivors. Out of these men, only around 5,000 made it back to Germany after the war. The news of the Sixth Army's surrender sent shockwaves through Germany. The invincible Nazi war machine had been defeated, conclusively, and the armies that defeated them had no intention of stopping at the Volga. The Soviets pushed back through their own lands, discovering horrific atrocities as they went, which only emboldened them further, eventually leading them to commit many atrocities of their own against German civilians. Of the 500,000 Soviet civilians who had inhabited Stalingrad before the battle, only 1,500 remained at the battle's end. The civilian death toll exceeded 200,000, larger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki together. Nearly 500,000 Axis soldiers and well over 700,000 Soviets died in the battle, along with many more wounded. Russia had come back from the brink of collapse. Even though the war would drag on for another 2 years, it is no exaggeration to say that the war was won at Stalingrad.